Good evening. This is Mae Brussell, and it's broadcast number 663, August the 20th, 1984. I haven't forgotten to continue for you part 2 of the Henry Kissinger link to Nazis. It is just pushed aside temporarily because of the other news stories. And I'm going to continue the recent appointments of Ronald Reagan, part 3. I haven't forgotten those either. But the news this week ties together as a whole, so I don't want to divert from what I see in the papers and what is happening now. But we will get back to those because they're all part of the same problem. But because the GOP convention is taking place in Dallas, Texas, and I had written an article and have done 20 years research on the links of the Nazis, Nazi Germany, the OSS, and the CIA to the murder of John Kennedy, I want to explain just briefly the news stories by title and then get to them one by one, not this week, there are too many, but to go over them again in analytic detail. But I want you to get the overview of what I'm trying to say here, because that's more important than taking 3 items and then breaking it up. I did that with some of the appointments of Ronald Reagan and listed the names so you know what you're going to hear in the future, details about these and other people. But I do want this full circle to have the continuity because of some very important stories, and I'll get to as many as I can in the hour. Number 1, the newspaper today, the Monterey Herald, has a story, famous Dallas sites draw convention, the delegates to the Republican convention, and listed among those sites is the grassy knoll, which is walking distance from where the convention is in Dallas, Texas. And in this article, it says the Texas School Book Depository, where Oswald allegedly fired the shots against President John F. Kennedy. And evidently they have a plaque there on the wall or part of the building acknowledging the fact that he allegedly did it, not that he fired any shot or the fatal shot that killed Robert, not Robert, this one's earlier, this is John Kennedy in 1963. Now the testimony of various witnesses, and the second hearing, actually the third, there was a Rockefeller Commission on the CIA and then the House Select Committee on Assassinations, came to the conclusion there was a conspiracy. But researchers such as Penn Jones Jr., who lives in Texas, Charles Spears, and various people, over 200, who have written books on the Kennedy assassination out of maybe 210 million in the country, have kept that truth alive, and at least, as I understand the newspaper article, they only have an allegedly fired shots, which is quite an admission. That is engraved, evidently, in Dallas now. Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon are actually men who stole the presidency because of the murder. They all worked together to cover it up to secret witnesses. Gerald Ford was put on the Warren Commission by Richard Nixon. Nixon got himself back into the White House, and Ronald Reagan was the selected person to follow Richard Nixon, according to my years of research, and it's all documented in the back tapes. Now, I'll briefly go into the DeLorean trial, not a lot of it, but again, it links to the Kennedy assassination. Remember, there was an article I had on broadcast number 583, Will DeLorean Deliver Hollywood? No, he didn't deliver anybody. DeLorean got off, and I usually begin the program with this time last year. This time last year, tape number 611, August the 22nd, 1984, I talked about John DeLorean's missing millions, the links to Mark Rich, Henry Kissinger, Licio Gelli, the fascist, Nazi, and the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. The tanglement of money and personalities weaving together, converging in Hollywood, the State Department, and so forth. DeLorean, of course, had to get off. When he got off, the trial, newspaper articles covering it had various items, but one of particular interest in the San Francisco Chronicle, August the 18th. Judge kept his cool during heated trial. This is Judge Robert M. Takasugi, Takasugi. He was appointed to the municipal court in 1973 by Ronald Reagan. Now remember, when Larry Flynt was showing these tapes of the DeLorean trial on national television, they were given to him by Gordon Novell, who has been accused of being an assassin in the John Kennedy murder, going back to Dallas and those days. and Larry Flynt was treated very cruelly by this judge and fined $20,000 a day to bring in that money, and then he was sent to a federal prison and a federal mental hospital where they could control his mind or influence his thinking and alter him in many ways that he doesn't know or we don't know for, future years to come. Now, President Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission nominated to the federal court this judge in 1976. So 1 month after Larry Flynt got out his LA Free Press with the story of Gerald Ford and Earl Warren, the Warren Commission, and the lying about the Kennedy assassination, he was shot in Georgia. 1 month after he decided to write the article on let me print the article on the JFK and the Nazis, publish it, and do more on the real story of the Kennedy assassination to the Nazi German connections. As soon as he decided to do that, within a month, people like Gordon Novell had moved into his house, G. Gordon Liddy, Mitchell Werbel. So Gordon Novell was part of the Kennedy assassination. He's been accused of it. He moved into the Larry Flynt home. Novell worked for people that Gerald Ford covered up. Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford put this judge from municipal court to the federal court. Gordon Novell went on the payroll of Larry Flynt. He was in his home, as I said, Mitchell Werbel. Gordon Novell was a friend of John DeLorean, planted tapes with Larry Flynt to blow the case. Gordon Novell was a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. Gordon Novell destroyed evidence in Watergate that made Gerald Ford president, and Gordon Novell is linked to letters to the jury coming from Congressman Edwards saying that the FBI stings are no good. Now, the jury names and addresses were given to some person, certainly not the prosecution or the Justice Department, unless they worked together with the defense to get him off. And the trial went on, and on the basis of those opinions, they didn't say thanks to the letters, but they mouthed the very words that were in the letter, and the judge should have had a mistrial, but instead he let DeLorean off. Another story on the DeLorean case, the lawyers of the winning team. This was also in the Chronicle, August the 17th. The Howard and Don Show, and it tells how every day after court there was a press conference and they stood at a certain spot and gave reviews. Donald Ray from Princeton, New Jersey, went to Princeton, he's from New Jersey, was one of the attorneys for DeLorean. He also represented Andrew D. Lee, a co-partner of Christopher Boyce. They were involved in alleged spying, working for the CIA, and also in cocaine traffic involving the Nugan Bank in Australia. And a year ago this week, I was talking of the links of DeLorean to the Nugan cocaine traffic, that ball of wax down there in Australia. He also is the attorney for the Church of Scientology, which I think is interesting, and Eddie Nash, who was wanted arson for profit with that mob group. Howard Weitzman, the other attorney for DeLorean, was the attorney for Mary Bruner, a member of the Manson family that got off. And I have made links to Manson family, to the Pancos case. It's been in the news, but it was set up by the Los Angeles Police Department and Sheriff Peter Pitches and the Operation Chaos and COINTEL program. It was actually the beginning of these mass murders that look like revolutionaries, counterintelligence in the United States, and then they reduced it to Charles Manson and dropped the links to Dallas, Texas, or Fort Worth, and Charles Watson and the connections of drug, CIA, and counterintelligence. So these attorneys could get their man off just on what they know and their interconnecting links, which isn't any different than the particular clients that they've had that I've talked about before on these cases. Now, there was a war council, changing the subject now to a war council, which I believe is setting the stage for World War III. It has to do with a meeting at the Monterey Peninsula of absolutely the A team. I'll read you their names and share some of this information with you. And then on other broadcasts, as I say, I'll give you detailed reports that were in the Monterey Herald of the particular meeting. But first of all, the newspapers this week, all the wire services, had the story, or most of them, Russian accounts of spying of the United States. And they pointed to the U.S. Embassy. One story in the San Francisco Chronicle, the U.S. Embassy, the Los Angeles Times had stories. Most of the papers that I take carried it on the wire service that the embassy is a den of spies. and the Soviet Union was charging that the Department of Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, is the source of a lot of spying that we send diplomats, graduate students, tourists, business executives, scholars, and seamen. That's also directly linked to the Institute of Foreign Studies here on the Monterey Peninsula, with John McCone, former director of the CIA when John Kennedy was killed, and a Knight of Malta with the Vatican, and part of the ITT hierarchy when Salvador Allende murder was ordered. John McCone is on the board of the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, and they share professors and work with the Department of Defense Language Institute in Monterey. And that's very important because this is a nest where we send people. I can name particular people that allegedly are hierarchies in the Civil Liberties Union, that are CIA, that have taken frequent trips to Moscow. A cover for their so-called trips of sharing and having peace is to attach themselves to well-meaning people as tourists and join the entourage. The other story that you never would get in your papers, only local here, Navy Postgraduate School hosts a meeting on Grenada lessons. That was 4 days here from August the 15th to the 20th. Attending this meeting, there were 60 people. These are the ones that were in our newspaper, and we'll have more articles about that, and I'll say break them down for you and other broadcasts. Vernon Walters, Ambassador at Large. He's, of course, a Knight of Malta from the Vatican. He's behind every major coup that ever took place for the United States government since the days of the OSS. He was down in Brazil responsible for that military dictatorship, the one that followed immediately the John Kennedy assassination. From November 63, in 1964 is when Brazil was overthrown with a military dictatorship. Winston Lord was here, president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, Vernon Walters is such a biggie. I mentioned him first. Winston Lord represented the Council on Foreign Relations. That's Mr. Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. Tom Farrer, F-A-R-E-R, from Rutgers University School of Law, also from the Council on Foreign Relations and Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Quote, Richard Pipes, you know him? Harvard University, former National Security Council and State Department. He's the man who said the Soviet Union must change its form of government or be wiped out. If you think that the Ronald Reagan statement was just a joke in the mic, it was a message, because the same week that all of this was taking place around Europe and in the United States, articles on what President Reagan said, he didn't make a mistake. He meant to say it. Mr. Pipes said it when he was working for Reagan, and he's one of the most violent anti-communists. So when he says Russia can't exist, and the president says it can't exist, that team member was out here in Monterey. Constantine Menges was here, M-E-N-G-E-S, Senior Director of Latin American Affairs from the National Security Council, Special Assistant to Ronald Reagan. Retired Army Lieutenant General Edward Rowney, Chairman of the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, Committee of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency that will not deal with the USSR that broke up the arms talks. John Matlock Jr., Special Assistant to the President, Senior, these are senior directors, not schleppers coming here, for the European and Soviet affairs. Mr. Pipes and George Bush were also on a team, the A and B team studying the Soviet affairs. Matlock is the Senior Director of Europe and the Soviet affairs on the National Security Council, because that ties in to the Grenada Blitzkrieg, identical to Hitler's invasion of Poland. I'll detail these roles later and what it means. Maurice Bishop had gone to the National Security Council when William Clark was the director of it and asked for assistance in Grenada. He didn't have to appeal to the Marxists at that time. He was turned down. Information about his visit was leaked to Mr. Cord down there and the people that killed Bishop by the information that he had been in Washington, where he was appealing for help to us, and then he was shot and murdered down there. And Nestor Sanchez, S-A-N-C-H-E-Z, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Inter-American Affairs, and 60 people participated. I've only given you 7 or 8 names. There were 60 participants from government agencies not named. I imagine the Defense Intelligence, the Air Force, the Navy. It was done at Navy post-grad. You know, when the men go to Annapolis, and women, they go for Navy 4-year training. Navy post-grad is the elite that go into the computer, the atomic sciences, the engineering, artwork, all kinds of things for people who have graduated beyond that. It is the elite of the Navy. The government agencies were all there. Universities were represented. I'm sure Stanford was there, and Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Private foundations, which I'm sure are the CIA fronts for the coups that come in and bring money and have their cover for spies to overthrow countries, and the National News Organization. And they'll be the future news people that will be at the next blitzkrieg, which it was a Hitler blitzkrieg in Grenada, and they will cover the news because the military said no news for 5 days, but this way they'll decide which news people who attended the military conference put on. It was sponsored by the Department of Defense, the Keenan Institute of Woodrow Wilson Center. Now, at the same time that this high-level meeting was going on, former National Security Advisor William Clark, that's Ronald Reagan's right-hand man and bag man, the guy that brought Helene von Damme from Europe and delivered her to Otto Bolschwing when they both arrived here from Germany and Vienna. Clark was on the Monterey Peninsula this week, photographed visually at Point Sur, handing over a Navy installation station to the state of California. But the timing was such that all of his employees, funkies, buddies, were here at the same time, and I can't believe he has to pass right by Monterey, the Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey, even to get to the airport. It's about 2 miles or a mile from the airport, and you go right by. So I can't believe that he didn't time the turning over of Point Sur, and the paper said he was here just before he leaves for Dallas, Texas. And also, the newspaper this morning had a story that John Lehman, who is Secretary of the Navy, a hierarchy in the Vatican enclave, working closely with the Vatican and for the ammunition he needs to make war against Russia, World War III. He was in China for 4 days at the identical time that these people were meeting in Monterey, the cream of the anti-Soviet group. And one of the things they had with them at this particular meeting were documents taken from the invasion of Grenada. And one story in the Monterey Herald, which again I'll share with you later, says that it was a very valuable meeting because they had all these treasure troves referred to, of captured documents ranging from a shopping list of military equipment to the minutes of high government meetings. Now, there were no witnesses when those documents were taken out of Maurice Bishop's desk. The people who got them, and I have pictures of them, were Mr. Brown, who publishes Soldiers of Fortune and had his special forces and his private mercenaries all over the place, rummaging through the papers of dead Bishop while the world press was kept off the island for 5 days. Along with him is Michael Ledeen, who's worked hard on the counterintelligence lies that the Bulgarian KGB shot John Paul the second. We know, I confused the murder of John Paul I, so many investigations, with the attempted murder of John Paul II. Ledeen and Claire Sterling have pushed that story for the Defense Department. Michael Ledeen works with Licio Gelli, who I have talked about constantly, and even up to last week. They got their hands on the papers. I have their pictures, Brown and Ledeen. And then we have a high-level meeting where they sit over these juicy things and discuss what they should do. And this is a great turning point in foreign policy, that America uses great aggression. And these papers are identical to the diary of Lee Harvey Oswald that was planted, or those KGB letters to the athletes, alleged KGB letters that were written to the athletic teams at the Olympic Games, saying that the Klan was going to get them. And then William French Smith says that they came from the KGB. And I'll do more on that in a few minutes. But this 4-day conference ended, and then some of them remained on the peninsula. Now, if there are threats to me and my family that caused me to go off the air for a while, I have a pretty good idea that by the time I got off the air last Monday and was making these tapes for you as private individuals, can you visualize if I was putting this tape on kazoo tonight over in Pacific Grove, and these people are in town? It said some of them are staying over visiting town after their meeting. These heavies with John Meese's son over at Fort Ord and all of these people surrounding this area. And here I've been hitting the grenade invasion as being as rotten and unexposed as anything like comparing to the John Kennedy assassination or the Korean Airlines story. This was a very important event, and now the team is studying it to get ready, I know, for World War III. They love that invasion. And the Monterey Peninsula hosted this conference. And as I say, I have to do a lot more with you on this conference and the particular statements. It was well covered in our paper, but I want to go on to other matters, as I stated. Now, in terms of taking this country, overthrowing it, causing chaos, such as the Bologna bombing in Italy, we have to have a lot of violence and a lot of teamwork to make people unnerved or unsettled. And one of the examples would have been at the Olympic Games if the Soviet Union had been there. And if Edwin Meese III were the Attorney General, there surely would have been a lot of this kind of violence. So when the Olympics came and went and they couldn't pull it, there was one last brahoo to have what I call the Olympic potential Reichstag. And the papers last week, August the 14th, had stories. You saw them. An officer finds bomb on Olympic bus. Heroic LAPD man removes the bomb from the Turkish bus, and it tells about his heroism, and that Mr. Daryl Gates from the Los Angeles Police Department, and I've talked about Western Goals and Gates for the past 2 years, Gates said that they were going to give this man the Medal of Valor for helping find that bomb. They evacuated 2,500 people from the airport, and as I say, we'll do even more details on this particular bomb story. But then the next day or 2 days later, there's a story, officer charged with planting the bomb on the bus. And it turns out that this is a member from the elite squad, that Metro Division that worked with the Police Intelligence Division that became the anti-terrorist unit. And Jimmy Wade Pearson, Pearson, is the man who put the bomb on the bus. Now, he's important, again, going back to Dallas, back to the Warren Commission. He was given a Hero's Medal of Honors for something he did. They don't know what. The records are locked up. They say those are always kept secret. And by Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, he was made a hero. This particular officer, just briefly, worked for Western Electric. Then he went into Navy intelligence. He had 2 stints in Vietnam. He took trips to Turkey with Jacques Cousteau. He was an elite guarding the most important potentates for the Olympic Games and the Special Bomb Squad team. And then it turns out that he's the one who planted the bomb as a last brahoo, I guess, to show that their hundreds of millions of dollars for security weren't wasted. And he was a hero working his way up maybe into the intelligence group. But somebody figured out that the bus couldn't have gotten through. No one could have gotten through the security to the bomb except somebody on the police force or in charge of security. And sure enough, he had this, he says, a little homemade bomb, but I'll do more on that in the Los Angeles Police Department's bombs and where they come from. So that story is thrown out. But had there not been a discovery that he did it, they would have blamed the Armenians, and that gets into the political group. Robert Keith Gray, the extension of the CIA in his public relations office with Paul Laxalt and William Casey, represents Turkey, and they want to lambast the Armenian group and keep making them responsible for terrorist acts against nice Turkey that is a member of the NATO group. Now, in Los Angeles Times, August 15th, 1984, a story, many vie for credit as terrorists. Now, Rand Corporation did many studies telling how the terrorists would be at the Olympic Games and who the American terrorists are, the people on American soil. And simultaneously, with the time that this particular man was identified and had to confess, he was throwing the bomb. A man claiming to represent the Armenian terrorist organization called the American Wire Service in Paris and claimed that he was responsible for the bomb, planting it on a Turkish Olympic team bus. Now, what are the mathematical chances that a confession was going on in Paris, that I did it as an Armenian? And again, it goes back to the planted letters, the disinformation, the lies, the planted diaries, the planted confessions. Somebody in Paris is saying, I did it, I'm an Armenian, and I bombed that, and it turns out that it is nothing but the Los Angeles Police Department with their own bombs. As I say, we'll go back to that in detail. I can't pass this story up now, but I just want to put it in a context of a lot of other news. And then at the same time that that was happening, there was a story by Elliot Abrams from he was hired by Reagan for the human rights and humanitarian affairs. Let's be fair to Turkey. They're loyal to NATO. They border Bulgaria, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria. They've had a rough going. And one of the ways to be fair to Turkey is to make it look like the Armenians are against them, that Turkey is a victim of this kind of violence and terrorism by the Armenians. And also the Lyndon LaRouche paper, not Solidarity, it's his other executive intelligence review. I want to separate the two. One is a newspaper and the other is a magazine. New Solidarity is the newspaper, executive intelligence review is the magazine. He published and sold at a very expensive price a special booklet on terrorist threat to North America. LaRouche is supposed to be the expert, and he told about the aggression of the Armenians and how they would be a danger at the World's Fair, the Olympic Games, the Republican Convention, Democratic Convention, and he has a long story on the terrible Armenians. And if the bomb had gone off, and if they didn't find out that it was the LABD who said it, then Lyndon LaRouche would come out looking like a real hero, because he told us that at the Olympic Games there would be this terrorism of the Armenians, and sure it is. It's right there, and luckily some honest cop picked it up and forced the confession of the guy who did it, or we'd still believe that the Turkish people were victims and that we were right to have so much security, and that the Soviet Union imports terrorism, and nations that are not working with us are possible terrorists to continue these acts when, again, they're done by the fascists and the Nazis all over the world. This is the way, as I say, you start World War III, or you build up to World War III, with this kind of terrorist activity that is so obvious. If you study the SLA is the CIA, which I did, set up by the Operation Chaos and Counterintelligence. These American terrorist groups are set up by the government. They're similar to Tsarist Russia, the pogroms. They're similar to Nazi Germany, blaming certain people for activities when they actually are done by yourself for the purpose of harming them, their credibility. And also, one of the reasons to scream terrorism is that you buy the guns, the mace, the SWAT teams, the helicopters, so that when there are genuine, hungry people, unemployed people, you don't distinguish them from poor and non-productive. You call them guerrillas or terrorists, and then you have the means to knock them down. And if we're going to an era where our steel is being controlled from overseas, our cars are being made along with Japan, our clothing factories are overseas. Ford Motor Company is building their factories over in Taiwan. I read this week, not all of them, but some of them. When the nurses are all brought in from the Philippines, when you buy everything that is not made in America or by Americans, and the labor is used overseas because it's cheaper, eventually you will need those teams to come back and control the mobs. So they create the excuse for the police before they get the mobs out on the streets, knowing eventually if you don't have health care and housing and education and entertainment or recreation, and there's nothing but street people and narcotics and muggings and murders, the police will come in to save you, and all the weapons were made and sold. So it's very important to blame these terrorists, as I say, like Hitler did, to get a police force, an elite force like that Blue Thunder, the Blue Teams, the Special Forces, the Rangers, to come in, the Soldiers of Fortune, to come in. And this story of the Los Angeles Police Department is the epitome of the cruds, of the people we were talking about that work with J. Paul from Western Goals with the Pentagon and the officials in Washington, D.C. If you haven't read all of those stories on the police department and the confession of the top elite policemen who got all these medals for heroism, but they won't say when or how. If you don't have that, and I'll do more detail on it because it's important to the whole stage from Nazi Germany to Dallas to the present time. We'll take a 1-minute break to turn over this tape, or a 1 second. We're not on the air now, so we can do it in 1 second, and I'll be back in side 2. This is broadcast number 663. It's August the 20th, 1983. Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of the tape. Now to get to the really heavy, as if the other wasn't, but the very, very important continuity of what I've just discussed with you and the Dallas conventions and what is going on in this past week in this country is tied to the work that I've done in the past. The San Francisco Chronicle has one story this morning, August 20th, born-again Christians' rising role in the GOP party. And it tells about getting the Christian drive out to vote to support the Republican Party and how important the Christians will be to this party. Now, that by itself would not mean so much, except that on the McNeil-Lehrer report, Friday, August the 17th, I have to send for that, they were talking about the different spectrum of the Republican Party from if there is a left or middle, like Senator Lowell Weicker, to the far right. And there was a gentleman on, I didn't catch his name, I have to send for it, I thought it sounded like Jarman, but I'm not sure. And he was saying that he represented the Christian religious right, and that they were not going to get out of the party. Mr. Phillips, the conservative, said we should have our own party. He said, we're not getting out of the Republican Party. The network is there. The frame is there. We are going to infiltrate the party and take it over and make it a Christian party. And we're going to get Ted Kennedy out so he doesn't try to run as a Democrat in 1988. That was the way the program went, that one of the political parties in the United States would now be a Christian party, and that's exactly what the Young Americans for Freedom were brought from Munich, Germany, to come over to help with the assassination of a Kennedy, with Robert Morris and the far right wing, Morris of the Vatican, Sovereign Military Order of Vatican again, and set up a coup in Dallas. And by 1984, when the elections come, he has said on the air, we are going to turn that party into a Christian party. And they specifically mentioned Senator Ted Kennedy. Well, the same day that he had Ted Kennedy's name on the air, August the 17th, Ted Kennedy was almost killed in Massachusetts. He had a car crash. Luckily, he wasn't badly hurt. He had cuts and bruises. His car was hit by a head-on pickup truck near Cape Cod. Now, everyone who knows the Kennedy family knows that they travel with their sons at Cape Cod in the summer at Hyannis Port, and one of the children, his son, was injured in the crash when the car came head-on with the truck. This is Robert Kennedy, and also Thomas Gargan, 13 years old, the son of a friend of Ted Kennedy's. Now, there have been other kamikaze murder crashes that I don't want to detail now, but I don't want you to think I forgot about them. One was the McDonald's shootout, a member of the Pose Comitatus and the far-right party who told his wife, I'm going to out and hunt people and kill them. The massacre in San Diego at McDonald's. The massacre in Westwood Village, where this fellow plowed into cars on purpose at the time of the Olympic Games. The San Francisco cable car crash, the Iranian, with important secretive links to intelligence and computer work and government agencies in this country. He took his car and plowed it straight down into the cable car. There were 3 massacres where people were injured and killed. These 3 types of massacres and attempted mass murders of people with the identical backgrounds and secrets of their background. And here's a head-on pickup truck that goes into Senator Kennedy at the time when this man is saying we will take over the party like Hitler did with the political party in Germany so that Kennedy isn't around. Now, another story that is very important to something I've mentioned on the programs is the plan to update the Constitution and change the Constitution. And this was in the San Francisco Chronicle, August 17th this week. And I'll do the details of what they want. There's just 2 things that are important to mention now. If the president is voted in as one party, they want the same party that controls the White House to control all the Congress. If Reagan gets in, then all the Congress should be Republican. And they would like to be able for the president to dissolve all of Congress and call for new elections anytime he wants. He can dissolve it if they don't behave themselves, and he can ease the restrictions that the Senate has on treaties. So the idea of doing over the Constitution appeared again. Both Republicans and Democrats have a finger in this. The exact same time that the convention is going now. Another big story that we could do an entire hour on is the attempt to reunify Germany at this time. Now, as soon as Richard von Weizsäcker, W-E-I-Z-S-A-C-K-E-R, became the president of Germany in May, he was a Nazi in Nazi Germany. His father worked with von Ribbentrop. Von Ribbentrop helped Hitler with the invasion of Poland. In 1939, almost from the day he was the president, he promised millions of dollars to El Salvador to wipe out the native population. He has heated up the argument for the reunification of Germany. And I have about 30 articles, and maybe you've seen them. Save them, because by themselves they may not mean anything to you, but together we'll discuss them at length. William Safire has a story, The Reunification of Germany. New York Times, August the 12th. The Kremlin views Bonn's recent loan as a Trojan horse. As soon as this Nazi was president of Germany, the Western Germans and Mr. Strauss and the worst conservatives gave $330 million to East Germany, and now they're saying, open up the gates, we'll give you money if you flood into West Germany. And this is the beginning of the resurgence of the Reinhard Gehlen legacy from World War II. I always call this the popcorn syndrome when I talk to my family or friends about it. You have a jar on your shelf with a bottle of unpopped corn, just the seeds, and you put it under heat, whether it's 20 years or 40 years. You keep raising the fire on, and pretty soon you have a whole kitchen full of popcorn. Well, the heat is on now, so the crises are showing where they didn't show before, or the size of them showing. The Wall Street Journal has an article on East Germany's deceptive détente. What they don't take into account is that East Germany and West Germany are predominantly still all Nazis who've been given the name East Germany but worked their way up. And so now they're getting closer, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union, with good reason, is very nervous about the proximity of the two and promising to make it one. In these speeches and articles, they're promising to make one Germany, and the Soviet Union broke that up after the war, and for a good reason, because they've had several attempts to wipe them out. This is the third time. And the reunification of Germany, the money going, the people involved, the Nazis involved, and particularly the new president of Germany, it came right after he was made president. He's done many acts that go back to the old Nazi behavior, but if you have Hermann Apps from Nuremberg sitting in charge of the Vatican Bank, the Nazi that worked with I.G. Farben and extermination at Dachau, and you let that one go, then what do you expect? Now, to heat up this East-West war, at the American Bar Association was Attorney General William French Smith saying that the KGB had forged letters to these athletes. I mentioned that earlier for one moment. Then you read the article in the small print. The letters were never passed around. They were never identified. The scientific analysis, according to the FBI, reveals they are classic examples of Soviet forgery, according to William French Smith. And as I said, when you read the small print, you find that there's a question about these letters. They won't make them public. They do not show them. They're not to the scrutiny of everybody who wants to see them. They are as secretive as the Oswald diary that Gerald Ford and Henry Luce linked, that the diary has never been wiped off for fingerprints. When they showed it to Marina Oswald, first witness before the Warren Commission, they said, this is a diary a copy of a diary purported to have been written by your husband. Nobody in the 26 volumes ever mentions the original or the examination of it, and I have almost, I guess, every book written on the Kennedy assassination. There's about 270, and I begged some person to go into the diary and find the diary, because when you let forged documents such as E. Howard Hunt forging the State Department papers saying that Kennedy ordered the murder of DM, or forging these letters to say that the FBI wants to discredit the Klan. The Klan is so great. And William French Smith is coming in on that. This is another part of heating up the Cold War, making it hot the way that the State Department and Ronald Reagan wanted. Now, Ronald Reagan's quotation about wanting to wipe out the Soviet Union and that he's pleased to announce it'll begin in 5 minutes was no joke. They call it a joke, and Reagan blames the press for carrying it. Not for what he said, but that is no joke. If you think it's a joke, go back to what Richard Pipe said about wiping out the Soviet Union. there's no difference. What he's doing is making himself endeared to the far right wing of the party, he makes sure they won't shoot him or get him out of the way for George Bush, and he wants to show how radical he is and where his mind really is. That was no slip. Reagan makes hardly any slips. There's one story in the Oregonian that was mailed to me by a listener. Military plans may force 1990 draft. We're planning to have a draft. Why? If we want peace. Another story, Reagan prods senators to back the MX missile. He wants the 10 warhead weapon that would cost starting with $6 billion. And that is no sign that he really wants peace. It looks more like he wants to bomb the Soviet Union. The Washington Spectator was mailed to me by another subscriber. It just has some brief figures on the billions of dollars. Where does the money go making weapons today? Air Force budget is increased 35.9%. The B-1 bomber cost $8.2 billion. That contract. The Navy's budget is up 33.5%. The Aegis cruiser is a $3.2 billion budget. Can you imagine the F-A-18 fighter, $2.8 billion budget, piling up weapons? In this article, it says similar to what we did in Vietnam, and getting ready, and compared to Hitler's Blitzkrieg, trying to go over the plains of Europe. And do they think that'll work? The article says it hardly will work, but they'll try it. And that's what Ronald Reagan was talking about. And if you want, we can do more on his so-called joke, but it wasn't a joke. Now, Ronald Reagan made his friend William Wilson, his close friend and man in charge of his personal finances, the envoy to the Vatican. But before Wilson went through, and after he mentioned he was going to do this, there was a story in the California Telegram, the Tribune, that said Bishop calls for world government. And there's a picture of Archbishop Laghi, L-A-G-H-I, the envoy of the Vatican, who was just entertained at Reagan's ranch just last week before the conventions began. The Catholic bishops talk about a world order. They have a section in the Catholic bishops' letter on war and peace, a section entitled World Order in Catholic Teaching, calling for an end to the present system of government by independent nation-states. Here, the bishops denounce the inadequacy of independent government and call for a more integrated international systems. They said we're entering an era of global interdependence requiring global systems of government, and they call Catholic educators to train their young people to accept a world government. Now, the far right wing always says that Nelson Rockefeller is the world government, the trilateral. These are the Catholic bishops saying that a centralized world government would be best for today and to increase their activism in world affairs. The St. Louis Review, printed August 12, 1983. The Holy See is more powerful than the United Nations, and they said they seek justice, human rights, and world peace. Well, you know what they did with Adolf Hitler, and the Catholic group the Holy See funded Adolf Hitler. Any world political force could not ignore the Roman Catholic institution with roughly 1 billion people under its influence. The result, according to the requirements of Catholic doctrine, would be the establishment of Catholicism as the world religion. This was in a paper just before Mr. Archbishop Laghi, L-E-G-H-I, became the envoy to the Vatican. Now, at the time that they were having the hearings on the Vatican, and this is important because of getting back to the Republican convention, and we can do some of these articles in detail later, Mr. Laghi was accused of asserting that the Pope's religious authority gives him a diplomatic standing in the world over above governments, a point that a Baptist Joint Committee contended at the time was an issue from the time the President wanted ambassador to the Vatican, that the Holy See had spiritual sovereignty, not over the dominion of a few acres in the heart of Rome, but over the entire world. This is what he wants, and this is what a few people wanted to stop, was the political push for an ambassador. This is in the Washington Times, but the Catholic Church won out, and Ronald Reagan won out, even though they want a one-world government under the Catholic Church. Mr. Luigi Laghi, L-A-G-H-I, was appointed as the envoy from the Vatican as soon as Mr. Wilson, who interferes with the Marcinkus case, and Paul Rich and so forth, is appointed. Now, last week before the War Council in Monterey, just a week before, before the Republican Convention in Dallas, Texas, which, again, a few blocks away, I said the Nazis in Europe and the Vatican, the OSS, the CIA had offed Kennedy at a corner, walking distance from where the convention is. Reagan entertained this Archbishop Pio Laghi at his home. He's only had the camera up at the ranch 3 times for a press conference. One for a certain foreign affairs reference that he made or decision to sign something. 2, when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip visited. 3, he wanted to be visualized at his ranch, and every single paper in the United States was there and invited to photograph and carry the story, partly because Geraldine Ferraro is a Catholic, and he wants to show, I'm having my bunch of grapes and carrots and so forth with the Vatican envoy. But what they were doing, he was conferring with him on sanctions. He was discussing political matters with this envoy from the Vatican about Eastern Europe. And also, as I said earlier, we now have a Nazi president of Germany that's going to combine the 2 Europes. We have a Pope who's Polish, an American envoy into the Vatican, and this story says it is rare for the president to interrupt his 18-day vacation at the ranch for such a meeting, especially since he already had decided to lift the sanctions. But he wanted to be photographed. Larry speaks emphasis on the consultation between Reagan and John Paul II and his representatives was unusual, especially considering the pains the Catholic presidential candidates have taken to stress their independence from the church, such as John Kennedy. He wanted the world to see that I'm asking the envoy from the Vatican what I should do in Poland. Not anybody who wants peace or to get along, but the Vatican, 99% Catholic, ran the concentrations in Poland. He's asking what we should do in Poland. And then, a week and a half later, another story, Polish farm aid sought by Reagan. And this is where it gets really iffy and dangerous. And I'll finish these articles on the international scene and all of this happening this week. Ronald Reagan spoke to a group of Polish people, and he promised them he would ask Congress for $10 million for Polish farmers. This is at a time when about over 100,000 American farms are closing. Small farms, ma and pa, crisis like the Depression of American farms. He wants our Congress, you, the taxpayers, to give $10 million to Polish farmers. But here is the most horrendous that fits in with the background I gave before. He wants the Vatican to dispense the money to the farmers. Reagan has asked for money. Now, the Vatican gave Lech Walesa $50 million, and it seemed to go down the drain. But in his speech, interrupted 24 times by applause, he said there's no reason to absolve Soviet Union from its commitment made after World War II to have free elections. Well, when the Soviet Union went to Yalta, when the Soviet Union went to Tehran, they weren't agreeing then that, or did they know that for 2 years previous, the Nazis were working with the American government. SS Karl Wolff was running Treblinka, Nazis in Italy occupation, Vatican, and working with Helen Douglas at Bern, Switzerland. They didn't know when they went to Yalta or Tehran that Reinhard Gehlen would become American officer in uniform to fly the United States and set up what Harry Truman called a Gestapo. They didn't know that the top Nazis of every country would be incorporated into the Anti-Communist League and continue the war, World War II. World War II never ended. When Yalta and Tehran took place, little did they dream that von Braun and Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger would be brought to this country. War criminals, stockpiles of bones, slave labor, bombing Europe with missiles, and people like von Braun would start building his legacy, our space stations, or that Dornberger would be hiring Michael Payne in Dallas-Fort Worth, the home where Lee Oswald and Marina Oswald stayed. So he's telling them that we can't absolve the Soviet Union of those agreements, and you don't have to be under permanent subjugation. We will free you, he says, on the 40th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising against the Nazis. All of a sudden they were anti-Nazi. And he said, we will help you be free from the Soviet Union. So this past week, the German Nazi president is saying, East and West Germany will be dissolved. The President of the United States is meeting with the Vatican envoy, and the money to go to the farmers would go from our Congress to the Vatican, and they would dispense it. The aid fund would be administered by the Roman Catholic Church in Poland. Now, what guarantee then they wouldn't buy guns and plant evidence and continue the propaganda against Eastern Europe? Our congressmen, if they want to give aid, should take it over in their little hands and find their little farmers and put a few seeds in each hand, like we do down in Africa where the drought is, and we throw them seeds with no water. What in the heck would our Congress fund the Vatican, dispense with money? That is the end of the separation of church and state 1,000 times over. You can write to your congressman on this, and if you don't have the wire service story, it was an Associated Press story on Reagan's promises to the American people and the Polish people. You give me that 10 million plus, and we will give it to the Vatican to dispense. This is not a Catholic country, and they should not give it to the Polish farmers because that Pope worked at Auschwitz for I.G. Farben. He hired his boss, who paid his checks when he worked at Solvay Chemical, and now we're going to aid the farmers by way of the Vatican. The Vatican should not dispense 1 cent of American dollars. This is not a Catholic country yet, or a Christian country yet, such as I heard on the McNeil-Lehrer report. And his promises that they would have that should really, really be questioned. And then he ends his speech, may you live 100 years. They're praising him, and he ends it, with accolades. And the head of the Polish Council of Unity in the United States gave him the cross of the Home Army of Poland, and they sang in Polish, may you live 100 years. He's lived long enough. I think he's lived too long, but that's another point when he goes that far. And then finally, with the Dallas, Texas story, and then we can go back and summarize this because this was a really heavy news week. Neil Regan, the president's older brother, called his White House and said, hey, brother, the Democrats didn't have any minister speaking at their convention. I think you should have a minister, a religious person, pray for the Republicans at their convention. This is the way the cover story goes. Sent to me by the Oregonian. I'm getting some wonderful articles from a friend up there that I don't see in many other places. So Brother Neil, who followed Mr. Goldwater, quoted over again of his radicalism in defense of freedom, the 1964 speech, and that's when he told Ronnie, you should be the governor, and pushed in quotes, that's when he did it. I know Ronnie was decided for this role many, many years ago before that, but there has to be a cover story of succession. Neil Reagan calls the White House and says, the Democrats didn't have any religious people. So Ronnie calls him back, and he says, dear brother, as the only Catholic in our family, you'll be happy to know that on the final night of the Republican convention, when I speak, the session will be open for prayer by the new Archbishop of California, John O'Connor. When I speak, the Catholic will be there. Now, this isn't necessarily trying just to counteract the Geraldine Ferrara Catholic vote. Reagan, long before he knew the vice president was going to be, was pulling in the Catholic fascists, Licio Gelli, Michael Sindona, Mr. Delle Chiaie that I talked about last week, the P2, the fascist link of the Vatican Party, the death squads from South America, from Spain, from France, the people, Otto Skorzeny, with the great train robbery in England, money going down to Brazil. Reagan has worked with all those cookies. This isn't new. But to summarize this past week, just to get it really straight with the Dallas Convention, this John DeLorean got off with his links to Klaus Barbie and the Nazis in South America, and involved in his trial was Gordon Novell, who also participated or allegedly participated and won't ever be charged or questioned with the murder of John Kennedy a few blocks from where their convention is. And the team that represented him are tied to other mob cases, to the drug cases, the Manson family, the counterintelligence terrorism. The meeting on this peninsula was of the heavies. We'll never, I suppose, know what 60 people were present. Some of the meetings, I understand, will be printed, but I can't believe they came all the way out here to have a public meeting of what they did, and that you're going to see every word that was said when they broke to have dinner or after the meetings at night or when they arrived. When you get Vernon Walters and Winston Lord and Richard Pipes and Mr. Menges and Lieutenant General Edward Rowney and Mr. Matlock, head of Soviet affairs, talking about Grenada, and Mr. Sanchez from the Defense Department, the Inter-American Affairs, you have a war powwow that will lead to World War III. These people have taken Grenada. Now, the next step after Grenada is Cuba or Nicaragua, in whichever order you want it. Long before Russia was in Central America, long before Castro was in Central America, United Fruit, the United Brands was taken over in Guatemala by the CIA, by John J. McCloy, by Helen Douglas, the same people around the Warren Commission, the same people that want to make the world safe for profits, to starve out the laborers. This has nothing to do with Marxism in Central America. It has to do with slave labor and profits, and the people rising up against the Somoza family and wanting their own country. And the day that they were kicked out, we began in Miami, Florida, and other cities training them to get those people away and put the Somoza army in. That team will go from Grenada to, they've done other countries, Chile and Pakistan and South Vietnam, South Korea, you name it, the country that they've overthrown. But they're going from Grenada to Nicaragua, then Cuba, or Cuba, Nicaragua. You can throw that around either way. I wouldn't guess which first. And then the Soviet Union. Mr. John Lehman is covering the oceans up above the Arctic Circle, up above Alaska and Siberia, those oceans, and all around Asia, circling it with ships. Our missiles will be deployed, and this team will gobble up these little countries that are of no value to anybody except as places to put missiles and bases and exploitation. After all this is done, by then, Poland will have its uprisings. We will promise Russians you have to deliver Poland for its, in quotes, freedom, to make it safe for war and concentration camps again. And Germany will be united, Asia surrounded, and this is what was happening with John Lehman over there in China, promising them, don't worry if we send Taiwan a few weapons, we'll give you some also. We will have a circle, Turkey and China, around the Soviet Union, getting ready for the lifelong dreams of Ronald Reagan. If he's not alive, they'll carry it on from him. But as I say, that little speech he gave at the warm-up was nothing but a terrorist speech indicating that I'm ready for World War III. They took a portrait of Ronald Reagan to Dallas made out of jelly beans. The image of him, the man with the jelly beans and the balloons, when they asked him about the article in Penthouse, or Playboy rather, no, it was Penthouse with the Miss America, and did he want to see it? He said, no, I'm a good boy. He refers to himself as a child, a boy, and he has these jelly bean portraits, and as I say, the blown up air, the hot air in the cavities, but this man is a vicious man, and his speech was not an error. And his meeting with the envoy from the Vatican, speaking to the Polish people, the German Nazi, and traveling East and West Germany, getting ready to unite. These are very serious times, and every day escalating are these meetings of instigations to get control of every land base. As I say, all Central America is the only thing left. South America is almost all Nazi and conservative anyway, and they can wipe out the Bolivian democracy in 10 minutes when they want and overthrow the president in Argentina. They sit on like a ball of jelly in a hot day's sun with the technology we have now to get what you want. These are very serious times. The war team was here. They will go out and praise themselves with Grenada, learn what mistakes they made, have the news next time, handpick the news people that'll be there, praise themselves for their success, and figure what little steps to make it palatable the next time so that there's no goose that somebody says, you bombed the mental hospital first. These stories are very important. And then next week, and in the weeks to come, I'll take some of these that I ran over very quickly and detail them, such as the LAPD story and other stories, because individually they make a sum total, and individually rather, they give a lot of more small parts of the big picture, but collectively they give a sum total, and that's what I was trying to do with you on this broadcast. I think that 1943 when the Nazis went under, 1963 when Kennedy was killed, and 1983 with the conventions, in 1984 the cycle of stirring these problems, 1983 the Grenada invasion, 1984 the elections, and then stirring up Poland and Germany is a well-constructed time plan, working on time, that really should be dissected by historians and people who love peace now before it's too late. Well, that's all for this hour. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. I hope. I will. I'll be okay. Take care, and I'll be back with you next week.